video is going to be a bit of a chunky, in-depth look at B-RAW on the LUMIX S5 IIX. These cameras, as you all know, offer a great range of internal recording codecs, whether that's long op, all intra, HEVC, and also ProRes. Over the last year, I've been shooting more and more projects in B-RAW on the LUMIX S5 IIX. Looking at these images over the last year, it really does feel like the B-RAW on the Mark IIs is a massive step up from the implementation on the original S5. But I've never done, in-depth side-by-side tests between all these different codecs to really look at what the differences are. We're going to be doing some side-by-side comparisons. We're going to be looking at how the quality of each codec differs and look at some of the ins and outs of recording B-RAW on these new cameras. On paper, capturing B-RAW obviously gives you much more data to play with in post. Internal recordings max out at 10-bit, whereas B-RAW gives you 12-bit files. So even if you capture in ProRes 422 HQ, you're not hitting the highest quality available from these cameras. So if you're shooting in mixed lighting or dodgy exposure, green screen, or just want to push your image around in the grade, then shooting in RAW will obviously give you much more flexibility to work with. Of course, it's not a magic bullet. If you put garbage in, you're still going to get garbage out. As many of you may know, shooting in RAW offers some really useful features when you're working in post, such as the ability to change your ISO value and white balance, rather than being baked into your footage, which is the case when you're shooting in internal or in ProRes. Here we've got a shot and I've incorrectly set the white balance in camera. It's shot at daylight and I've set the camera to 2500 Kelvin. You can see what happens when we try and correct it in post with the white balance slider in Resolve. It's not an easy fix, and a lot of the colors and exposure are sort of mushed up as you try and make this sort of brute force adjustment to pull it back to the right color temperature. Now let's look at the RAW file. We can go into our RAW tab and make the easy white balance change here. And you can see here that the difference we're able to capture is much more balanced and faithful than the sort of brute force technique we have to use basically when we're using internal or compressed media. For these cameras, you are able to change the ISO values under the RAW tab, but you don't see that as a sort of stepped ISO value. What you get is this exposure value adjustment, and that is essentially the same effect as adjusting the ISO. What's happened here is that Blackmagic made it like this because different cameras will rate ISOs differently. So unfortunately, there can't be like a unified ISO tab that will work across all cameras. If you were to underexpose or overexpose your image, you have a lot more to play around with in the RAW images. So let's take a look. Here we have an image underexposed by 2 stops, and we're going to pull it back in post. So there's noise apparent in all of these images, but the B-RAW image has probably what I would call the most defined noise, and that's a good thing. RAW should be noisy. There should be little to no noise reduction being applied to the RAW image. And that's the problem with the internal recordings, because there is some quite aggressive noise reduction going on, which if you look at the noisy areas leads to quite a mushy, swimmy image, and that really begins to affect image clarity. The B-RAW escapes most of that, and it just gives you much more control in post, and ultimately preserves detail and gives you a much better final image. Here we're 3 stops overexposed, and you can see that the bright area on my nice shiny forehead is clipping. On every example, if we pull it down, it's pretty much unsalvageable. Even on the Mark I B-RAW, it's unsalvageable as well. However, the B-RAW on the Mark IIs has a little trick up its sleeve, as it now has this nifty thing called highlight recovery. Watch what happens when I apply it here. The once clip highlights that we see in all of the other files are sort of magically restored. From what I gather, this uses clever maths to basically reconstruct the highlight data using whatever available information is here from non-clip channels. It basically provides you with a bit of additional latitude in post beyond your usual clipping points. If you do look closely at this, it's not 100% perfect, but it's definitely usable and capable of salvaging the shot which would have been lost. Now, you might say you don't need this, you expose your subjects perfectly, but what about all the other elements in your frame? What about windows, the lights in the back of your frame, lighting that you can't control? This is where this feature becomes really useful, and it's a massive benefit of the new B-RAW implementation on these cameras. How cool is that, being able to save shots in post using this feature? Another reason to shoot RAW is that on the Mark II cameras, there does seem to be, a bit more aggressive image processing going on inside on the internal compressed recordings. Over sharpened looking images. I feel like there's a bit more noise on these cameras, and I've also noticed a bit more banding in contrast gradients on the internally recorded files on the Mark II cameras. So in these comparisons, I kind of want to look a bit closer at the overall picture quality or characteristics between these different files. I don't think you'll be able to see the differences between these files as clearly as I can on my computer, on YouTube. One of the things that was quite surprising is just the differences between the BRAW, the internal recordings, in terms of contrast, color reproduction. BRAW on the Mark IIs just seems to have a much nicer, smoother image. It's still sharp, but the sharpness feels much more natural, dare I say, organic looking. And when I sort of cast an eye over these other images, they are sharp, but the sharpness that is apparent in these images, it just seems to be a sharpness that comes from sort of digital sharpening, so it looks more processed. It's sort of sharpness, I'd say, without the detail to back it up. So if we look at my beard here, on my computer I can see it quite clearly that the detail on the B-RAW file is there, whereas the detail on the internal and even on the ProRes file is a bit more muddy. And you get this kind of like sharpened artifacting that is common when you apply digital sharpening. I feel like the B-RAW produces the most faithful, neutral image, and ideally that's what you want as a starting point when you begin to work and grade your image in post. I think what surprised me the most when comparing these images is just how different the ProRes recording looks. So I had to double check this when I got the files back, but there is what seems to be like a real gamma shift going on in this image. Just look at the dark areas, this black area here. It seems to be pulled down much more in the ProRes recording than on the B-RAW, on the other internal compressed codecs. And I think this is something you should really be aware of when shooting ProRes, especially if you're mixing it with other vlog recordings. Let's take a quick look at how the B-RAW on the Mark II cameras compares to the original B-RAW implementation on the Mark I S5. In my opinion, the new B-RAW implementation looks much nicer. The Mark I seems to have that internal processing present in the B-RAW. It looks a little bit over sharpened. It just overall doesn't look as nice or as natural or as organic as this new implementation. I think LUMIX and Blackmagic, whatever they've been doing to collaborate, have done a fantastic job in the B-RAW implementation on the Mark II cameras. One thing that seems to catch out a lot of people is that you can't capture open gate in B-RAW on these cameras. So if you're shooting at the highest resolution, you're going to be locked to shooting in 16:9, and you can only go up to 30 frames a second. If you drop down to 4K in crop sensor mode, then you unlock up to 60 frames a second. When you're recording on the Video Assist and in B-RAW, there are a selection of different quality levels that you can record at. The main two options are constant bitrate or constant quality. Constant bitrate locks the bitrate, so whatever you're recording at the same bitrate throughout the file. Constant quality, however, is like a variable bitrate recording mode, which will vary the bitrate depending on the complexity of the thing that you're shooting. So if you're shooting like loads of trees or a snowstorm, it'll bump that bitrate up to cover the complexity of that scene. And these different quality levels are just sort of the quality levels of the variable bitrate. I tend to prefer constant bitrate because you just know what you're getting, you know how much time is left on your recording media. With constant quality, throughout the day, your remaining time on your recording media will change because the bitrate is always changing. The file sizes will vary from file to file. In terms of constant bitrate, in terms of which bitrates to use, I'd recommend jumping between 5:1 and 8:1. Generally, I would record something longer like an interview at 8:1. And then switch to my B-roll at around 5:1. 12:1 might be great for YouTube content. If you just want like a slightly higher recording format that is just a bit more than something like all intra, but with the benefit of the RAW features, have a look at 12:1. 3:1 is super chunky. I'll quickly show you how much recording time you get if you're shooting at 25 frames at full resolution, 5.9K, with a 1TB SSD. So at 3:1, you'll get about an hour. 5:1, you'll get about 112 minutes. 8:1, you get about 180 minutes. And then at 12:1, you'll get 269 minutes, big chunky amount of record time. Recording time may determine, which qualities you want to shoot at, because the thing about shooting RAW is that you do need to consider the data rates in your workflow. Once you get your B-RAW into Davinci Resolve and you have it on your timeline, you go to the color tab, you can navigate to the RAW tab here, and you'll see something like this. Under decode using, you can select between using a Blackmagic default, which uses the Blackmagic profile, camera metadata, which will apply the settings used at the time of shooting, project, if you have any project specific RAW settings, or you can go down to clip, which you might find the most useful, which will allow you to change settings on a clip by clip basis. It's here where you'll be able to change your color temperature, exposure or ISO value, and adjust the tint. One of the great things about B-RAW is that you are not locked in to using the Panasonic color profile, V-Gamut or V-Log. If instead you want to move the color profile into the Blackmagic color space, you'll now see that these settings are unlocked and you can make more granular adjustments. It's up to you which of these you use, but just bear in mind if you're using the LUTs that are designed for V-Log, then they may not work as intended when you're in a different color space. The first one's quite a big one, to be honest. It's monitor delay or latency. So if you want to pass audio through to your video assist, then this will really hit the delay and lag that you see on the monitor. I can live with this for interviews, but for anything else, it's not super workable in my opinion. So if I am shooting B-roll, then I tend to disable the audio pass-through, and generally I tend to just record audio externally anyway, and then just stick with like a clap sync on interviews just to sort of remove the issue of that latency. When you don't have the audio pass-through, there's still a bit of latency, but for me it's not enough to sort of really bother me. Obviously when you're shooting RAW, you're recording externally. That does introduce other points of failure in your workflow, especially when you're using HDMI cable and an SSD cable. So you want to make sure all of those are sort of locked down and secured and sort of pinned in. I personally wondered what would happen if the recording got interrupted, if the HDMI cable got yanked out. So on these tests, I'm just going to hold up this timer to the phone, and at 10 seconds I'm going to yank the HDMI cable out to see where that terminates the recording. And as you can see here, the recording pretty much freezes on that frame when I've yanked out the cable, but it still continues to record. Interestingly, when I place the cable back in, the video doesn't come back in. So although everything up to that moment is saved, you'd have to stop and restart the recording to continue. Here we've got the SSD cable being yanked out from the recorder side. Quite surprising actually, the recording just automatically terminates and everything up until that point is safe and sound and ready to go. So that's really reassuring, both on the HDMI front and on the USB front, that should those cables get yanked out, anything that you recorded up to that point should be safe. I think if you want to work with the best picture quality that is available out of these cameras, and you want to skip some of that internal processing that seems to be going on behind the scenes, I really recommend considering B-RAW for your next project. Of course, you could also choose ProRes RAW, but I think the functionality and convenience of B-RAW far outweighs that of ProRes RAW. I think the implementation of B-RAW on the Mark II cameras is a massive step up from the original S5, and it just offers a great balance between data rates and the ability to push your image around in post. The cost of this, I think, is also really attractive. You can pick up a video assist for around £500–600, and the cost of the LUMIX S5 IIX fluctuates between £1,500 and £2,000. So if you're lucky, you could pick up a RAW capable setup for between £2,000 and £2,500. The fact that this is all available on a tiny compact camera, a hybrid camera that gives you features like IBIS and autofocus, is a testament to what LUMIX has done with these little cameras. And I'm really interested to see how they're going to implement B-RAW into their next flagship camera, whatever that might be. Will we see internal B-RAW on a future LUMIX camera? I don't know. I don't even know if that's allowed or possible, but I would love to see that myself personally. I hope this video has been useful. Thank you for sticking around and watching through these tests. If you are new here, then check out some of the other LUMIX content I have across my channel. But thanks for watching. I'm Ed Prosser, and until next time, see you later.